We are going to be having a very special presenter tonight. Heidi Ritchie is a senior policy analyst at Mass Audubon with over 25 years of experience in land use planning and environmental policy. And Carol Lisbon suggested she come talk to us, so I wanted to do a shout out to Carol, who won an environmental award from the United States EPA. The program focuses on sustainable and smart development techniques supporting landscape resiliency for both ecological integrity and human communities. She was previously an advisor to the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs and very involved in the most recent update of the state's model open space design / natural resource protection zoning. And when we thought about having Heidi join us, we thought not only about how it may or may not pertain to 46 Springdale, but also to all the other properties in Dover that eventually might come on the market and be an opportunity where we're going to have similar discussions as to what our committee is having now. And so we thought the timing was good. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Heidi.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you all for coming out on this warm summer evening. I'm so glad to see so many people in the community involved. I really appreciate this opportunity to come and speak with you. And as Catherine indicated, she and Carol invited me to come talk not just about the fate of this particular property that you're looking at right now, but also other undeveloped properties in town and some options for the future. And I want to compliment the committee. Actually, I've looked at their materials online, and they're really doing a very good job analyzing the property, its resources, what's adjacent to it, and all of the potential options for its future use. So I feel confident that your community will make good choices here, and I'm not really here to recommend to you one way or another what you should do with that particular property, but I hope that the information I present is of use to you. So as Catherine indicated, the Shaping the Future of Your Community program works to provide assistance to communities on sustainable development, and we're focusing mainly on the areas of the state that are most rapidly developing. This program has been in place since 2009, and I also want to give a shout out to Stephanie Covino, who is our new project coordinator for the program, and to Christina Wiseman, she just got married recently, who is the assistant to our department and director of public policy and government relations. So the big idea I'm going to focus on tonight is that conservation and development don't have to necessarily be in conflict, although so often they've been pictured in that sense that isn't really necessary or really the best way to look at things, because obviously we all need housing and jobs, but we also value our natural communities, our community character, our historic assets, etc. I just want to take a few minutes to put this in the context of what's going on statewide. Are any of you familiar with Mass Audubon's reports called Losing Ground? Yes, there's at least a few folks in the audience who are. We've been developing and releasing these reports approximately every 5 years for the last several decades. The 5th edition came out last year, 2014. And what we've done is analysis of land use patterns and trends and development trends across the state. And what we found with the most recent analysis, which covered the period from 2005 to 2013, was that really the trends were basically continuing along the same lines that they had been in previous decades, although at a lesser pace. So most of the development that's happening is centered around the 495 belt and either side of that, and also a bit out in the southern Connecticut Valley. The good news is that the rate of loss of development of land to development has decreased over the last few decades. So it was only 13 acres per day over this period of study, and the rate of land protection has increased, so it's actually 3 times that. However, this period was also an anomaly in some respects because, of course, it was during the middle of the Great Recession, and also at a time when the state is very focused on land protection and on assisting communities with land protection. So, we are already seeing an uptick in building permits. We're seeing a great increase in the number of phone calls and emails that we get from people who are concerned about development in their community. And this is what they usually call me about. They usually say, there's this development that's happening in my town. There's these beautiful woods. I see animals there all the time. I've enjoyed walking there for years. And could you please come to the local meeting and tell them to say no? And so I have to go about explaining how Massachusetts land use laws work and how it's so important for people to get involved in their communities. And again, you folks are lucky here to have so many people who are engaged and involved, because all too often people don't get involved until there's something that they just really want to stop and it's too late. So most of the development that we're seeing continues to be large lot residential development, single-family homes, and there are many costs associated with that form of development, both in terms of environmental impacts and impacts to our communities and to our daily lives. So I've listed some of them up here on the screen. I'm not going to repeat them all, but it's both energy-wise, land-wise, habitat, community character, loss of farmland, etc. And overall, we're sort of at a crossroads in the state. We've reached a point where approximately 1/4 of the state land is developed, 1/4 is permanently protected, and there's about half of it that's still up for grabs. And of course, that varies by community from one place to another. And here in Dover, this is a map created from MassGIS data. So I apologize if there's anything that's out of date. That would be due to the state's data layer. But at any rate, this gives sort of a snapshot picture for Dover. And the areas in green are permanently protected. The areas in yellow are developed. And the areas in pink are the areas in yellow are limited protection, such as either Chapter 61 or town-owned land that's not under permanent protection. The areas in white are developed. And then the areas in pink are undeveloped and unprotected. And I recognize that does include Hale Reservation, which is, perhaps not an imminent threat of development, but nonetheless, there are many parcels in town here that are undeveloped and unprotected, as identified in your open space plan. There's about 750 acres of Chapter 61 lands that are under current use taxation. I understand the Springdale property was before the town purchased it. And then, of course, you have your zoning and your land use rules. And in Dover, much of the land is zoned for residential 1 or residential 2, so 1 or 2 acre lot zoning. And within that, there are requirements for minimum frontage, such as for R2, 200 feet minimum frontage on a road. There has to be a 200 by 200 foot perfect square that can fit within the lot. There needs to be a setback of 60 feet from the road right-of-way, which the road itself may only be 22 feet wide, but the right-of-way would be perhaps 60 feet wide, so you're talking about large setbacks from roads. And, these kinds of things are designed to maintain character, and you have a lovely community here, I must say. It's, you should be very proud of it. It's beautiful. But in terms of the future, there's a possibility of 500 or more homes maybe even over 1,000, depending on which analysis you look at, whether it's the towns or the regional planning agencies. And if that takes place according to conventional zoning, it will consume basically most of the upland on those properties. And the reason for that is the conventional zoning. So when you have land that's very valuable and somebody wants to develop it, they're going to try to maximize the number of units that they can get out of it. So they will take all of the upland and fit as many of those lots that they can within that kind of geometric configuration that the zoning calls for. And all of that is perfectly understandable and legal, but what it does mean is that really any upland that's out there that's not permanently protected will be developed. And if it doesn't get developed in this kind of configuration, then you might see a 40B proposed. And of course the town, with the not meeting the state's requirements for the amount of affordable housing, is vulnerable to 40Bs. So there may be other ways, and some of what I'm going to talk about with conservation subdivision and some of the case studies, some communities have actually used this alternative kind of zoning in combination with the friendly 40Bs, working with developers in an RFP sort of way, saying this is what we want to see, some affordable housing developed within other market-based housing, but in a configuration that protects natural resources. So that's what conservation subdivision design or open space design or natural resource protection design is. It really sort of three similar terms for the same overall approach. That's what it's really all about. And the nice thing about this is that you can get additional land protected basically for free, not having to pay for it. Or if the town already does own it, then you could do a limited development of part of the property, recoup some of your investment in the property, and protect the part that you're most concerned with. So the way conservation subdivision design works is different than the traditional zoning that I was talking about. And this is an example. And basically what's different about it is that instead of looking at geometric requirements, and when you first begin to design a development on a site, the first thing you look at is what's there now, what's important to us. Where are the natural resources, not just the wetlands, but upland forests or fields, and I know that here in Dover you don't have a lot of fields left undeveloped, and even historic sites or stone walls, old trees, there could just views, there could be a variety of features that could be included within this. So that analysis comes first. And only after that first step is done, then you begin to look at, well, where would we put the house lots? And in this particular example, they've placed the houses around the edges of the fields for the views. Now, if you're in a community that really would much more value protecting those fields in their entirety, rather than having houses even intrude to that degree, you might design this development differently and carve out a piece of the forest that was least significant ecologically, say, and didn't have any vernal pools near it, or wasn't near a stream, that kind of thing, wasn't particularly old or of special character, and maybe you'd put the houses there instead. And then after you've done that second step, then you would draw in lines connecting those houses with roads. And the way the zoning is designed in the model bylaw, there's more flexibility as well in terms of the layout of the roads and their width and their design. There's a whole another layer of information that I could go into that I don't really have time tonight, but would be happy to refer you to sources of information on that. In how roads can be designed in a more environmentally friendly way, low impact development. So it's only the final last step where the lot lines are drawn in, and in this kind of approach, there's more flexibility, less rigorous requirements for frontage, for lot size. I mean, there still are some requirements, but it's much more flexible, and the focus is much more on protecting the resources and the character of the land. So just again, quickly to compare and contrast the four-step approach of the open space residential or conservation design approach versus what's done under conventional zoning, where at the very end, if there's something that was left over and it was too steep or too close to wetlands, then maybe it would be left untouched. But it's probably going to be part of somebody's backyard. And again, just contrasting the result. So I just wanted to move on quickly before I talk about case studies and give you some real-life examples. I wanted to clarify on terminology because there's a lot of confusion out there and it's kind of a lot of jargon, these different terms. And so I was just going to take a moment to quickly review this. So cluster was kind of the initial form of this type of approach that was done, starting back in the late 70s and the early 80s. And what it did is it said, well, we're going to allow some more density. We'll allow houses to be closer together in exchange for some small amount of open space, typically on the order of like 10% of the lot, to be protected. And sometimes with cluster, it could even be that that protected land would be the wetlands that they couldn't develop anyway. There often were no requirements that it be of any particular significance, either natural character or community character. Didn't need to be connected to other protected lands, didn't need to be useful for wildlife habitat or for trails. It was just, well, we're going to put the houses closer together and have some open space somewhere in the vicinity. Evolving from that in the later 80s and 90s, communities began to say, well, you know, that really doesn't do what we need. And they learned about this four-step approach and began to adopt bylaws that were called either open space design or conservation subdivision, where there was more of an emphasis on protecting the important parts of the parcel. But even so, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, there were many kind of procedural issues with a lot of those bylaws that are on the books. And we compared in 37 communities in the 495 region that were part of the regional plan that was done a couple of years ago. We looked at each one of those bylaws in relation to the state's current model, which is the natural resource protection zoning model, and we found that not a single one met even like 80% of the criteria that's considered the best practices these days. So, but you know, realistically, I also recognize that it's tough to get zoning changes through town meeting. You have to have a 2/3 vote, and you all know that's not always easy to get, and that it's very complex. And people like their communities the way they are, and they say, why should we change anything? So just to touch briefly on some of the provisions of the state's current best practices model that they feel are really very important. This model was developed by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Kurt Gertner, who's the Sustainable Development Director there, in consultation with some of the top land use lawyers in the state, community planners, planning directors, and other professionals in the land use realm. So it had a lot of input from a lot of different people. And what they came up with was a bylaw, and I have a few copies in the back room, and I also have a link to this on the end of this presentation. I will make this presentation available to you all for posting on the web. They identified features of the bylaw that they thought were most important, but at the same time, within this model bylaw, it provides options and alternatives for communities, because they recognize that a community in the Berkshires is very different than Dover, or, you know, even just towns 20 miles away can be very different and have different interests and focus. So while they may recommend a range of things, like they may say, we recommend that at least 50% of the land of the upland within a parcel be protected under this, they give you the flexibility to say, well, what really works for your community? So some of the key provisions are that there's the high percentage of upland protected, much more so than these earlier cluster or open space bylaws. That the selection of the protected areas is done according to this kind of natural resource analysis approach. That there is connectivity among the protected lands to the greatest extent possible, both within the parcel and onto adjoining parcels. And that the planning for the location of what is protected is tied into the town's plans, the open space plan, and if there's open space components in the master plan, et cetera. One of the key issues that comes up is, should this type of development be allowed automatically by right, or should it only be allowed under special permits? And until recently, a lot of communities have adopted bylaws that only allow conservation subdivisions under special permits. That you can, by right, you can be assured that if you meet that 2 acres, 200-foot frontage, and minimum setbacks, et cetera, you will be guaranteed your permit. You'll get permission to build. If you want to go this other route, you have to go through a special permit process. You have to get a supermajority vote of approval. You may be subject to all sorts of conditions which aren't written down anywhere until the board decides what they want to apply to your particular project. And you can imagine that for a developer, this creates a lot of uncertainty. And it may also create additional time and costs. And they've got, a bank that's concerned with when are you going to get this done and pay us back. So in a lot of these communities that have adopted the older bylaws, they're just not used, except for the places where the planning boards have really gone above and beyond to reach out to developers and try to hold their hands and assure them, like, yes, we'll work you through this process and we're going to make it work for you. But in a lot of places, these bylaws have been on the books for years and have not been used a single time. The formula versus dual plans is another issue that comes up a lot. Many communities require, this is like determining yield. How many houses should you be allowed to build on a particular parcel? And there's a lot of concern that by allowing this more flexible approach, smaller lot sizes and more flexibility on frontage, et cetera, that developers will get away with something. And that they'll get to build stuff that they wouldn't otherwise be allowed to build. So towns say, well, first go through a conventional planning process, show us what you'd be able to build that way, and then we'll think about whether we're going to let you do it a different way. But again, the problem is that that can be very costly and time-consuming, especially if they have to do, engineering plans and soil borings and everything. At the same time, there are legitimate concerns with you're on septic and private wells, and how do you know that you'd really be able to perk out all those lots and get all that development? Well, there's a balancing here. The community has to decide, do we really want this more flexible approach to be utilized, or do we want to maintain, certain rigid standards where we know what we'll get, and it will be basically development of all the upland. The formulas that are now recommended in the model bylaw, I think, are pretty protective. And what they suggest is that you first subtract out all the wetlands, all the steep slopes, all the areas that are clearly undevelopable anyway. And then you subtract out further a percentage based on the fact that there's going to have to be some roads and right-of-ways and utilities and all that. And then only after that do you begin to calculate how many units might be allowed based on the remaining acreage left. And there's a lot of flexibility in that model, again, for communities to do this in such a way that, maybe it's approximately equal to what they would have gotten anyway under conventional zoning. Maybe it's less, maybe it's more. particularly if they voluntarily offer some affordable units or senior housing units in it. But those types of provisions can be worked out by the community, and there's guidance on different options available. The other thing that's been tightened up in the current model is procedures for how the open space actually gets protected. I've seen projects happen in communities where there was a permit issued and it said this area is going to be permanently protected. It will be put under a conservation restriction or transferred to a conservation entity. But when the permit was issued, they didn't know who that entity was going to be. They didn't know if anybody wanted to accept it. They didn't say when that had to happen. And I've actually seen projects built where there are people living in the houses and the land still hadn't been protected. And, you know, maybe now the developer's moved on to something else. So the new model bylaw really clarifies all of that, and that's what some of the land use lawyers who had some input into it said, this is like an orderly way to make sure this happens. And then also, how is the land going to be maintained in the future? So if you have a field, are you going to manage it for wildlife habitat and mow it once a year, late in the summer or the fall? Or are you going to maintain it in mowed grass and use it for recreation and for public gatherings and that kind of thing? And who's responsible for that maintenance? And for periodic inspections and making sure there's not encroachments and all that kind of thing. And then finally, the provisions about density bonuses that I mentioned earlier. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about case study examples. This is sort of a made-up example that EEA has come up with, showing just, you know, one possible option of what might happen on 100 acres forested property with a stream and a wetland along the edge and running through the middle. And in this particular example, 75% of the site is protected. The ultimate yield is less than it would be under conventional zoning. But as I said, you can craft a bylaw to make it be less, to make it be more, to make it be approximately the same. It is possible to draw up the bylaw in any of those ways. Okay, now this is a real-life example from Hopkinton. And it was a parcel of about 100 acres, and it ultimately ended up being developed into 34 lots, and 52% of the land was protected. At the top was a conventional plan that was actually drawn up and approved by the original developer, got it through the process and approved, but then never proceeded with the development. And when it was purchased by another entity, that individual was willing to work with the town on an alternative approach. So that's when they came up with the middle plan, which was more of an open space design type plan. But it still had 43 units in there. And the ones kind of in the center, in the darker outlined lines there, those were approved, but with the understanding that they would never be built. Because what the developer realized and worked out with the town was that the cost of building the infrastructure into that part of the property was going to be high. The increased value of the lots adjoining that extra open space was going to be at least $50,000 per lot. Plus, there were some conservation tax incentives that they could get by donating this land to a land trust. So they were able to actually have their dollars come out better by not developing those lots, but by having them approved. So that, I mean, it's some funny legal gymnastics, yeah, but the result at the end was better for everybody. This is in Bellingham, and it's a smaller parcel, an example of how sometimes these bylaws are only applied to very large parcels. This one was more on I think it was about 15 acres altogether. And again, they could have done a conventional development. They could have done the 12 lots on the right there. But there were wetland issues involved and also some rare species habitat. So that they ended up, the developer and the town worked together and said, well, instead of building 12 single-family homes, let's do 6 duplexes and put them all on the lower part of the property there in this other configuration. And that ended up protecting the majority of the site. Now I'm going to show you a few examples from Westford. That we did a tour to some of these sites last fall, and I believe Carol came on the tour. And it was really nice to see this kind of in real life and how these things play out on the ground. So this place, Jarvis Way in Westford, a guy named Joe Flaherty bought the property, was thinking about developing it, it's one of the write-ups as well in the back where we had case studies, so you can read more about it. And he came to the planning board with a conventional plan, the one on the right there. And they said, well, you know what, there's this guy in town who's going to be speaking, his name's Randall Arendt. He's got some different ideas about how to do residential developments that may be a little bit more flexible, a little bit better. And why don't you go listen to him and then come back and talk to us? And he was so impressed, and he'd come from Ireland and he understood the kind of country landscape and the value of common open space and fields and that kind of thing. And he said, wow, this is really cool. And so he decided to instead do a conservation design. And this was his first project that he built that way, and it was built according to the design on the left. And this is more of an artistic rendering of that. And then this is what it looks like today. And a couple of features I want to point out here. On the upper left, this is a large common open area. And the site kind of drains into that area, so they were able to keep the roads very narrow. The community agreed to that, but also rather than to have curbing and to pipe all the stormwater, they have it all sheet run off into these vegetated areas that are able to then absorb that water. And that area is used regularly for community gatherings and picnics and, little pickup games with the kids and all that kind of thing. But it's a very attractive result. This is another larger project in Westford. It's over 100 units. And this addresses another key issue that we have in Massachusetts land use law, which is approval not required. We're the only state in the country that says that if you own land along an existing right-of-way, you can develop it as long as you meet minimum lot size and frontage. And you can't be subject to, subdivision review and all that. You can just divide up the land along the road. So this particular parcel was adjacent to a large swamp that fed into a pond, and they could have, by right, done the development as per the left side plan that would have had house lots going right up to the edge of that swamp. And instead, they worked with the developer. Again, Westford has been very proactive in talking with developers and working through things. And they were able to reconfigure the whole development so that there was a significant area between the roadway and that swamp that was permanently protected. And you can see there, it's a large meadow area. It's really fascinating wildlife habitat. And there is a plan, and it's managed and mowed regularly and all that. And again, they also granted waivers on like road widths and that sort of thing. There still is curbing here, but it's not your typical subdivision road. So in Westford, they've been doing conservation subdivisions since 1978. and they've gotten better and better at it with experience over time. And there's been about 48 subdivisions developed that way since then, and they've protected over 1,700 acres of land without having to buy a single acre of it. And they've also got 13 miles of interconnected public trails. Yeah. And this is just a shot of Jarvis Way, showing it in the context of some of the other lands in town. And there's a trail that connects over to the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail, which is a regional rail trail. So moving on to kind of a larger scale and a little bit different part of the state, but it's another fascinating example, I think. You may have heard of the Pine Hills down in Plymouth. Very large development, thousands of acres. It was a 3,000-acre property. And running through the middle of it is this road. This is Old Sandwich Road. This is the oldest permanently extant, I don't know how to exactly say this, the oldest unpaved public way in the country. And it's been in continuous use for a very, very long time. So when developer bought this property and started thinking about developing it, first thing he looked at was, well, approval not required, A&R. This is an existing public way. I can put in hundreds of houses all along this road and improve the road so it would no longer look like that picture that you saw. And the developer, though, said, you know, maybe I want to do something more creative here. This is really a special site. And they went and talked to the planning board and to the selectmen, and one of the things they talked about was, well, if you're going to make me upgrade roads to certain standards and everything, tell me what roads in town you like best. And the town officials who came back with their answers, every single one of the roads that they answered with would not be allowed under the current zoning, the strict standard conventional zoning rules. So that kind of opened up their eyes and said, well, maybe we need to be more flexible and do something different here. And they did. And that road was protected and maintained in its natural historic state, and other roads were built instead, but still to smaller standards and with country drainage and all that. And the homes were built on the site that were multifamily homes, which people thought, you know, is anybody going to buy that? And this big, there's a golf course there, and, you know, this fancy development, and, you know, this guy's going to go bankrupt. Well, no, he didn't. Actually sold like hotcakes because the place was so well designed. Every single one of those homes has its own private view. So nobody's looking into somebody else's backyard. And they have all these amenities and trails and other things on the property. So in the past 14 years since this project has been under development, they've created over $1 billion worth of increased property value in town. And the net value in terms of revenue versus expenses to the town for this development is $15 million a year. And again, in Plymouth, they've done quite a few conservation subdivisions, not just this one massive one, and they've been protecting about 2/3 of the land. Finally, I just wanted to end with something that's kind of a different example, but it's good, I think, for projects that are close to town centers, for example. This is sort of a cottage neighborhood project over in West Concord. And the first thing you'll notice about this is that there are no driveways to those houses. They're all centered on like a common alley, but the parking is centralized just up above those houses. And there is emergency access. There's a route along the back side of the houses that's also used as a way for people to get canoes down to the river to go canoeing. But the town officials were able to see a different way of things here, and that, well, maybe houses didn't have to all have their own individual driveway. It's kind of, an interesting configuration of a lot, this long, narrow piece of land. It's along the Assabet River. There were a couple of existing buildings out front that were rehabbed, and then a couple more buildings put behind that, and then the parking, and then those homes that you saw. And this also has, in addition to that central alleyway, people can walk and gather, there's like a pavilion and a place with an outdoor fire pit, and there's a community garden. So these homes went on sale during the depths of the Great Recession, and they all sold in a matter of months. And these are some pictures that I took on a site visit there. The other interesting thing about this, they incorporated a lot of other green features, so they are designed to be net zero possible homes. So a lot of them did put solar on there, but they're also super insulated. And that has not only the energy savings value, but it also contributes to making this work where the setbacks between the homes are so small so that you're not getting noise from your neighbors when you're inside your house. But they do still each have their own yard and their own area where they can garden, as well as the community garden. And then they dealt with the drainage from the shared parking area using low-impact development techniques with landscaping. So these were just a few of the comments that the developer had heard about his project. I mean, that's the connectivity and the knowing your neighbors and having kids play together and adults gather and talk to each other and all that. That's one of the other big advantages of this kind of approach, because the large lots, big lawns, I mean, people live in neighborhoods for years and never get to meet their neighbors sometimes. These are some of the resources that are available. There's a whole toolkit online from the state. In addition to the model bylaw, there's stuff about wastewater alternatives for like communities that are dealing with, well, we don't have a sewer system, we don't have centralized water for most of the town. How can we incorporate low impact development techniques? So there's all sorts of related information. And then we also have resources online on our website, statistics and mapping tools and the like. So just want to quickly summarize that there are many, many benefits to this kind of flexible approach. Benefits to municipal infrastructure. You have less roads and utilities and stormwater to manage. There's more preservation of the natural landscape, less clearing and grading, better protection for water resources, greater setbacks from water resources than the wetlands rules would require, better, keeping things out of harm's way from flooding, better protection of farmlands. This technique can also be used to enable an agricultural preservation restriction to be placed on farmlands so that a farmer can develop some corner of their property that they're not actively using for farming and get enough money to keep it, keep the rest of it in farm use or to make it a community farm. And provide, property values as well as places for people to enjoy. So there's that, and we're going to pass out some evaluation forms. We'd love to have your feedback on this talk and to hear from you about if there are other topics that you'd like us to do and other future programs that we put on. So I really encourage you to fill that out during the Q&A session, and happy to answer any questions. Yes.
I was curious, I had a slide in there that indicated 53% of the Commonwealth's land is either developed or protected.
That's right.
I'm curious, do you happen to know what surrounding states or nationally what those numbers are?
I don't know off the top of my head. I do know that we are generally considered to be the third most urbanized state in the country by population density. So, if that means anything.
Do you know within the state how much that land is west of versus east?
Well, right, a much larger percentage of it is undeveloped and unprotected west of 495. But like, for example, here in Dover, you have about 30% of the land is permanently protected. And about 7.5% is in Chapter 61. So I don't know how much is developed, about a quarter? Yeah. Tru- Right, but trustees' land is considered protected, yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Some of the handouts on the other examples that I provided but I didn't present include a couple of examples where communities actually purchased a property and then worked to do a friendly 40B, but protect a good part of it. So I don't know if that may be useful to your committee, I hope.
I have a question. In terms of the state's model of the space bylaw, is that something where, have you seen other communities adopt that?
Yes, there are a number of communities that have adopted it. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. The question is, are there communities that have adopted the state's model natural resource protection zoning bylaw? And the answer is yes, there are several. Most of them are in western Massachusetts. There's also Brewster on Cape Cod, and there are a few others that are actively considering it right now. We're working with the town of Pepperell, and there are some communities that have adopted kind of a hybrid. They've improved their old cluster or open space bylaw to some extent, but they didn't totally embrace every single provision of the new model. And, so that's another option. I think every community is different. Yes.
One concern, and that is these areas that are permanently protected. How permanent is permanent? I mean, what if, if 15 years from now, people change their minds, can that land then be developed?
Right. So the question is, how permanent is permanent? And is the land that is set aside within these developments truly permanently protected? And the answer is that it typically is truly permanently protected in terms of either being transferred to local conservation commission, where it would be subject to Article 97 of the state constitution. It requires a 2/3 vote of the legislature to overturn. Or it could be held by a land trust with a conservation restriction, and similarly that would also be subject to Article 97, or sometimes donated to a state agency that again would be subject to that. There are provisions in state law that under some circumstances these lands can be put under a homeowners association with just a more of a regular deed restriction. But that's generally not the preferred option, and most communities that have employed this try to go with the others to the greatest extent possible. And nothing is ever truly permanently protected because we have things like the Kinder Morgan pipeline that's proposing to come in across the state, where the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission can come in and overrule Article 97 of the state constitution. And if they decide that, selling gas to Europe is more important than protecting something that we've all worked to protect, then, we can't overrule Congress. But I'd say for the most part, Article 97 is pretty permanent. Yes?
You used a couple of great examples from Westford. You said that they were doing this since 1978. I don't know how I missed it, but is it that built into the bylaws, or is it special permit every on it, usually the conservation style?
That's right, yeah. So the question is, in Westford, that's been doing these kinds of developments since 1978, which version of this did they use. And they've evolved it a little bit over time and modified their bylaws over time, but they actually still have used the special permit approach. And they have not gone to the full extent of, 50% or more of the parcel like the current model recommends. But what they have done is that they have a long track record of granting the special permits and granting the waivers. So I think that gives the developers like a little bit more feeling like they're going to be able to get somewhere. So maybe they're a little different in that regard than some of the towns that have not had as much success. Yes?
Like you, I work for a regional land trust, and I know we would much prefer holding land in fee simple than to hold a conservation restriction. Could you comment on those properties that we've seen? Are they held in fee simple? And the reason with the conservation restriction, you basically need an endowment to prevent encroachments, and you're always watching the homeowners, and, are they going to build or going outside the building envelope, et cetera?
Right.
It's often hard to get a developer to give us what we consider to be a substantial endowment if we were to agree to hold a conservation restriction.
Right, no, and that, so the issue is for land trusts, whether they get the land in fee simple, total ownership, or whether they just have a conservation restriction, and the costs and endowment needed to maintain land if it is under conservation restriction. And that is one of the issues that's come up, the procedural issues about monitoring and follow-up. One of the options that can be done is to have one conservation entity own the fee and another entity own the conservation restriction. So some towns, the town will own the CR and the trust will own the fee. And I don't know for certain in each one of the examples I showed exactly which way was used for each of them. But there are those different options available.
So specifically whether endowments were given on any of those properties too?
I don't know, I could ask the Westford Conservation Trust. I think they did mention that they've been working on that and have been increasingly in recent years looking for that. Most of the land trusts now are looking for some kind of endowment to come with land, and that's part of the whole procedural thing, that if you're going to give land for conservation, you have to make sure it's going to be monitored and maintained and not dumped upon, or the trails aren't maintained or whatever. Yes?
Does Mass Audubon consult with or work with developers and communities for the conservation subdivision plans, or is there a group of land planners that are going to identify them that get focused on that type of plan?
So you're wondering if we work with particular developers or particular communities?
Development approach or community approach with Mass
Yeah, we have land protection staff who I know have worked with specific developers and municipalities on a variety of land protection projects, often close to one of our existing sanctuaries. And then if somebody contacts our land protection staff and wants to do something like that and it's not near one of our priorities, we'll try to connect them with someone else who may be able to help them. We are a co-founder and part of the Massachusetts Land Trust Coalition. So, and we're trying more and more to connect with developers who want to do this kind of thing. I've been glad to meet a few of them in recent years. But even in talking with them, I said, well, could I come to maybe a lunch meeting with some other like-minded developers? And each one of them that I've met so far has said, well, I don't belong to the Mass Home Builders Association because they don't really think the way I do, and we don't so I mean it would be great to get like a Green Developers Association going.
One of the questions, 40 Bs, have any of those communities reached their 10% affordable housing?
So the question is, have any of the communities that I just showed reached their 10% affordable housing? I don't know about Westford or Concord, whether they're there yet. I know that Concord has done several different friendly, affordable housing types projects. Some of the examples on the handouts in the back as well are affordable housing, like Lincoln. yeah, has done it, right. And it takes a concerted effort over time, because you can't just do it with one project, but if you can work to incorporate it kind of within every project that happens, then it's much more likely to get you to where you, because it's always a moving target, as you know. Pine Hills in Plymouth, do they have affordable housing there? Honestly, I don't know what the percentage is. I believe there are some affordable units, but I don't know. I'm sorry that I'm not able to answer the affordable housing questions as much as you might like. It's not my particular area of expertise, but we can find additional resources for you on that.
Great, great. Well, thank you so much, Heidi.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to very insightful, and a lot of information that I think pertains very well to communities like Dover, as well as the state as a whole. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming. The Springdale Study Committee is going to have their breakout session now, so we'll be gathering, and you'll be hearing more from us. If you're not already getting our emails, you can email me on the town website, or you can also go to the part of the website for the Springdale Study Committee and sign up to be on our email distribution list yourself. I think many of you know that we're going to be doing a survey of the town. If you haven't already contacted us about that, we don't like to barrage people with emails, but it's going to be a survey regarding specifically 46 Springdale, and we want to get as much input from the community as we possibly can. So make sure we're informed if you're interested in that. Thank you for coming.